Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be covering Jest and the ins and outs of Jest in great detail. Now before we do that, let me just quickly explain what Jest is. As you can see here, I am in the jest.io landing page, and it says here that Jest is a delightful JavaScript testing framework. And what it will allow us to do is to test our applications that either use TypeScript, Node, React, Angular, or Vue. So it's really versatile. It can work with front-end and back-end JavaScript applications, and it's a really good framework to work with. And so this is what I will be teaching you today. Now, everything that I'm going to be teaching you in this video can be found in the Jest docs. So you can go to the Jest docs if you want a refresher. Now, if you do not want to read it and just want to watch the video, then just proceed. I'll be explaining everything that is going on over here. Okay, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to get started. So as you can see here, getting started, we have a bunch of instructions. So what we want to do is we want to install Jest on our machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a fresh instance of VS Code, and it opened up an empty directory called JustCC for Just Crash Course. You can do the same thing. And now what I'm going to do is just going to quickly open the integrated terminal. I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. And let's just decrease the size of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this command. So this is the npm install --save dev jest. So this allows us to install Jest on our local machine. Actually, before we do that, we need to create a npm project. So let's just do npm init-y. And of course, you're going to need to install Node for this if you don't have it installed. So let's go ahead and let's just do npm install --save -dev. And then Jest. Hopefully this doesn't take too long because I do not want to pause the video. But if it does, I probably will have to pause the video, but it seems like it's almost done. Alright, so that is pretty much it. Let's actually just go ahead and get started with our very first test. So in here, let's create a function, and I'm going to call this function sum.js. So this is going to be a very simple function. All it's going to do is just take two numbers and return the sum of them. So in JavaScript, we would just say sum, and then we can say num1, num2, and then ultimately we can just return num1 plus num2. This is a very simple function, but let's test if it works. In the future, maybe somebody is making some changes inside of this function, and then ultimately it doesn't result in the same exact thing that we want it to result in. So let's give this a test. Now, of course, we can do a manual test, but it is also better to introduce automated tests as well in combination with manual tests. Now, if we want to test this function, what we would do is we would create another file, and we would call this sum.test.js. So it would be the exact same name as this, but instead we have this test before the or after the sum and before the JS. And what will happen now is because we installed Jest, when we run it, it's going to look for the file with this structure over here. So it's going to be whatever the name of the file is, .test.js. It's going to look for that, and it's going to execute the tests in this file. All right, so let's go about doing this right now. So first of all, we installed Jest over here. So now we have access to a bunch of different things that we wouldn't have access to otherwise if we didn't install it. Now, if you don't know anything about tests, tests have to exist inside of a test block. So you can specify a test block by saying it or test. And what this will be is a function. So you can see here it, and I'm going to say it for now. And you don't have to import it. Just will understand exactly what it is. And this function that we're invoking has two parameters. The first parameter is the name of the test describing what the test is doing. And the second parameter is a callback. And then in here, we're going to have all of our logic. So this is where all of the logic, this is where our test is going to live. And so, okay, so what is going to be the name of this very first test? Well, we're going to say it adds 1 plus 2 to equal 3. So that's going to be the name of our test. And I'm going to say here should. I like having should add 1 plus 2 to equal 3. All right, so that is the name of our test. But now what we want to do is we want to get this function over here, and we want to invoke this function and then test the results of this function. So what we can do is, well, let's export this function out. So we can do a modules.export, and we can export the sum. And then over here, let's just do a const sum, and we're going to require that from sum.js. And now what we can do is we can say, well, let's just get the result of it. So let's say sum or result is equal to sum, and then over here we can say 1 as the first parameter and 2 as the second. Remember, it takes in number 1, number 2, adds them up and returns them. So we should get this over here. We should get a result of 3. Now what we want to do is we want to ultimately do is test if the result is equal to 3. And this is where an assertion comes into place. So what do we expect here? Well, we expect that the result is equal to 3. And this is exactly what we are going to say through an assertion inside of this test block. So we're going to say expect. You don't have to import any of this. It just understands it. And we're going to say expect.results. And then we need to append a matcher. So, okay, what do we expect? Well, to append a matcher, we can say dot. And then we can say to be. Dot to be. And then, okay, well, what do we expect it to be? Well, we expect it to be 3. Now, there's many different matchers, but this is the one that we're going to be using now. Now, let's just go ahead and let's run this test. So to run this test, let's go to our package.json and change the script from test, echo, error, whatever, to test jest. And now what we can do inside of our terminal is just do npm run test. And we see our first passing test. Now, if this test were to fail, and we were to say something like 7, then yeah, it would fail. So you can see here that the test has failed. All right, cool. So now let's just talk a little bit more about some of the matchers. I like to have a nice green passing test. Let's just talk a little bit more about some of the matchers. So over here we have to be, but there's also something else called to equal. So to equal. So to be and to equal, they might seem like the same thing. But let me show you an example where you would want to use to equal over to be. All right, so let's just say here we have another test block. And what we can do also, and I'll probably preface this too, we can group common tests together in something known as a describe block. And this is going to have the exact same structure, but we're not going to have, this describe block is not a test itself, it's just a way that we can group tests together. So over here we can say, I can say example tests. So over here we can have that, and then over here we can have our other test. So let me just show you something where to be is not really going to work. So I'm going to say object assignment. So over here we're assigning an object. And let's say that over here we have const object, and this object is equal to this over here. So object is equal to an empty object. And so you might expect that this object is to be this object. And now if we were to run this, we would get a failure. So you can see here we get one passing, which is this one over here. And you can tell which one's failing by, well, it will tell you, it says, hey, this is failing. Now, this is kind of strange because it worked here. Like if I were to change this to 3, it works. You can see here that this works, this passes, but this one fails for some reason, even though this is an empty object and this is an empty object as well. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is kind of a tricky reason, kind of a nuance to JavaScript. I'm just gonna quickly explain this. So if I were to go to node over here and I were to say something like 3 triple equals 3, or actually that doesn't work. Let me let me just console.log it over here. So if I were to do console.log 3 triple equals 3, and we were to, let's just do a, let's actually just do that inside of this over here. So now we were to do node sum, you can see we get true. And then over here, we can do an empty string is equal to an empty string, we also get true. However, it's not the same case when we do something like objects or arrays. So if we were to save this, we would get false because this object is actually different than this object. So if we were to do an array as well, we would go here and we would get false. So in this case over here, to be is kind of similar to what I was doing over here in our terminal. But if we really just wanted to check if this object is exactly the same as this object with the same things inside of it, then what we would instead use is to equal. So we would say to equal, and then over here, if we were to do npm run test, we would say here it passes. So that is when we would want to use to equal over to be, is when we want to look at the equality of something like an object or an array. All right, so those are some example tests. Let's look at some other matchers. So let's look at matchers that deal with truthy or falsy values. So let's actually have another describe block right over here. Describe, and I'm gonna have truthy or falsy. So this is what we're introducing. So sometimes what we ultimately want to know if something is truthy or falsy. Now what do I mean by that? Well, in JavaScript, we obviously we have true, the boolean true, and then we also have false, the boolean false. But also, hopefully you guys know this, but things like null would result in false. So if I were to do something like if let's actually do this again in the sum over here. So let's go here, let's do sum. And so if I were to do something like if true, and I were to do console.log this is truthy, and then over here I'm going to have else console.log this is falsy. I never know if I have to introduce or have to add the e in the falsy or not. So if true, we're going to run this, but if it's false, we're going to run this. So now if we were to do a node sum, we get this is truthy because, well, this is true. And if I were to, of course, change this to false, then we would get this as falsy. However, if we were to have some sort of string in here, so it's just this random string, this actually evaluates to truthy. However, if we have an empty string, this evaluates to falsy. So there's certain things that evaluate to truthy, and there's certain things that evaluate to falsy. Almost all, so there's actually, it's actually better to focus on the things that evaluate to falsy, and that's what we'll do because there's just a few of them that evaluate to falsy. The rest actually go ahead and evaluate to truthy. So null evaluates to falsy. We have undefined that evaluates to falsy. An empty string evaluates to falsy, as we saw. 0 also evaluates to falsy. So there's actually a bunch of things that evaluate to falsy. So over here, what we might want to do is we might want to see if something either evaluates to falsy or truthy. So over here, let's say that we have a test, and we're going to call this null because we're just going to have a null value. And then over here, we're going to say const n is equal to null. So const n is equal to null. So what we might want to do is we just want to see, maybe at the end of a function call, we get this null value back. And what we want to do is we want to know if it's truthy or falsy. So what we can do is we can say expect, so we can expect n, to be truthy. And by the way, if you don't know about these matchers, what you can do, I probably won't cover all of them, but what you can do is you can just go to the docs over here. You can see all of the matchers over here. I'll try to cover as much as possible, but I might miss some. All right, so over here you can say to be truthy. Actually, well, this is gonna fail because null is falsy. So what I'll say is falsy. So falsy actually doesn't have an E. I just realized. So npm run test, and you can see that this passes. Now what we can also do is we can say, well, I expect M, and you can have multiple expects in the same test. I do not recommend it though, but it is possible. So we can say to be truthy, but over here we can append to not dot be truthy. So you can get the opposite of anything by appending this not over here. So if you were to save this, this should pass as well. Now 3 tests pass, not 4, because again we can have multiple expects, and if any one of the expects fails, then the whole test fails. However, if all of them pass, then the test passes. And that's not really a good idea, because sometimes if a test were to fail and you have a lot of expects in there, then you might be a little bit confused as to exactly which part of it is failing. So it's highly recommended to just have one expect. I'm just kind of doing this to just for illustrative purposes. Now another thing that I want to note is sometimes you want to know, okay, well, is this a null value or is this undefined? So you can actually do that. Instead of looking at whether it's true or false, you can just do dot to be null. So it's to be null. And over here we can run this, and you can see it should still pass. All right, cool. And of course, if this was undefined, what you can do is you can say here to be undefined. Now in this case, this test will fail. Let's just run it because this is null and it's not undefined. So what I can do is just append this not over here and say that it is not undefined. All right, cool. And obviously the same thing kind of holds true with 0. So 0 is also going to be a falsy value. So let me just quickly comment this stuff out. And if I were to change this to 0, you can see that this will pass as well, because we have these 2 expect statements. And I can also add an empty string in there, and it should still pass. So an empty string, and it should still pass. And it does. All right, cool. So now let's move on to numbers. So we're going to look at some of the matchers for numbers. So let's have a describe block over here. We're going to call this numbers. And then we are going to have our callback. And then, okay, so let's say we have 2 numbers, and we're adding 2 numbers together. So let's just say here, let's say 2 plus 2, and we want to test what the value of that is. So let's go over here and let's just say const value is equal to 2 plus 2. Of course, this is not what you're going to be doing. You're probably going to be testing functions, but the principle of this is the same. At the end of the day, maybe the function is going to return a number, and you're going to want to test that number. So one thing that you can do is you can expect that the value, and in this case you can use to be, you can also use to equal as well. You can expect the value is equal to 4. And we have already kind of done this already with the sum function, so you can see that that works. Another thing that we can do is we can expect that this value is greater than another value. So what we can say is we can say expect that this value, and then over here we can say to be greater than, and then over here we can say to be greater than 3. So this is greater than 3, so this works. However, if I were to change this to 5, it fails. All right, so let us move on. We can also do if we want to be greater than or equal to. So to be greater than or equal to 3, that also works. So if I were to change this, let me just prove this to you. If I were to change this to 4, this wouldn't work because 4 is not greater than 4. So let's just go ahead here, and you can see that that doesn't work. But now if I were to change this back to 3, and then I were to change this to to 4, and now we're to run this, everything should pass perfectly. Another thing that we can do is just like we can do to be greater than, we can also do less than, to be less than, and this time we want it to be less than like 7. And then over here we can also do less than or equal to, and then we'll just leave this one at 4. So this should be exactly the same. This should also pass. I hope this is kind of self-explanatory. All right, cool. So what is left? Well, let's now move on to maybe decimals. So maybe what we do here is we're adding numbers. We're adding floats. That's like the term for numbers in JavaScript, or really, I think all programming languages. So over here we have const value, and this is equal to 0.1 plus 0.2. What we can do here is we can do something like expect, and maybe what we're doing in our function is we're adding a lot of we're adding two numbers with a lot of decimal places together. And so what we can do is we can say, okay, well, we might not get the precise value, but what we can say is, okay, well, we expect this to be, if I can get rid of this, to be close to, and I can say to be close to 0.3. Now, in this case, it's going to pass. Now, let's see. I actually haven't tested this out. Let's say I were to change this to this. I'm just hoping this would also pass, and it does. So you can see here that it doesn't have to be the exact precise value. I do not know what the limit is. Let's see if that passes. Again, I guess that fails because that's not close. Let's see if I were to change this to 0.9. Okay, I guess that has to be relatively close. I'm not really sure exactly how close it has to be, but you guys get the point. Okay, cool. All right, so that is the matchers when it comes to numbers. Now let's move on to strings. So some of the matchers that you might want to deal with strings. So over here, let's put strings. Okay, all right, so what is the next step? Well, over here, what we can do is we can have regular expressions if we want to test. So for example, if I were to have a statement here, or a test block saying there is no I in team, well, let's actually test that. Let's test if there is no I in team. So what we can do is we can expect team, and then we can have some sort of regular expression. So we can say to match. So to match dot to match, and then over here, if you don't know what regular expressions are, they're just something that a regular expression is something that will test that hey, this matches this regular expression, this set of rules. So in this case, we're expecting that this string doesn't match this regular expression, so we can say over here not. And if we were to change this, you can see that that works. Now there's multiple other ones. So we have string matching. So over here, we're matching strings. String contains. So let's see here what this does. So over here, we're saying string match. So over here, we have an array. I guess this is more of an array thing. We'll talk about arrays later, but you can kind of go through the all of the matchers. There's actually not a lot of matchers, so you can use them as you will, and they should be relatively easy to learn. All right, so let's actually, speaking of arrays, let's move on to arrays. So let's do here describe. We're gonna say arrays. All right, so over here we have this array, and let's say we have an array of shopping lists. So we have an array of shopping lists, and this is equal to, let's say, diapers. I'm honestly just copying what the documentation has. Kleenex. Let's go trash can or trash bags. That's what they had. Paper towels. So just a lot of cleaning supplies. And this is what the documentation has, and then randomly it has milk. So okay, so this is an array that we have, And what if we wanted to test that, hey, this array contains a certain value? Let's say that we want to test that it has milk in it. Well, we can do that relatively easily. So what we can say here is we can say expect, and we can expect that this shopping list, and then we can say dot to contain, and then we can say that it contains milk. So if we were to run this, it should pass. All right, that is terrific. And you can see, of course, that there's multiple other ones that we can utilize. I am not going to get into them, but again, you can utilize many different array methods. All right, so let's now talk about one last thing, and that is exceptions. So let's go over here. This exception. So if you don't know what an exception is, it's just you know, when you have a function and maybe something goes wrong and you go ahead and you throw an error, that's an exception. I'll show you exactly what that is right now. So let's say we have a function. So over here, I don't know, it compiles. Over here they say that it compiles. We have a function that compiles Android code. So this is a function that compiles Android code, and it's a terrible function. The first thing it does is just throws an error. So it throws a new error, and it says here, you are using the wrong JDK. All right, or JDK, yeah. And so now what we can do is we can have a test that actually tests this error over here, that this actually ends up throwing an exception. So if a part of our function, we have some sort of logic, and then if that logic fails, we want to throw an exception, we can actually cache that logic. And then over here, what we can say is we can say something like, okay, so compiling, so let's just say compiling Android goes as expected, which, well, it fails, I guess. So that's, and then over here, what we can say is we can expect, and we want to call this function. So we want to call this function. So let's call this function. We're going to call it by having an arrow function that calls it. And then we're going to say to throw, because this is going to throw an error. So if we were to run this, it should pass, because this throws an error. Now we can also specify that, hey, this is going to throw an error. So over here, we can also say to throw an error. Now what we can also do is in here, we can also say that we expect it to throw, because maybe our function has multiple errors that it throws. Well, we expect it to throw an error that contains this string over here. You're using the wrong JDK. And as you can see, it passes. All right, cool. So that is matchers and some of the different methods. Again, I'm not really able to cover all of them. Hopefully the ones that I did cover just kind of got you the basis. But again, you can always just read exactly what these do. They're not very difficult. They're very intuitive. All right, so that is pretty much it for the matchers, and I'll see you guys in the next section. So far, we have been testing synchronous functions, but we might have a lot of functions that are asynchronous that we want to test. For example, we may have a function that fetches data and returns that data, and the way that we're testing it right now actually won't work for that type of function because, again, that function is asynchronous. So in this section, we're going to learn how to deal with asynchronous functions when we're testing them with Jest, and thankfully, it's actually relatively easy. If you know how to work with asynchronous functions normally, it's kind of similar to how you would do it in a test. So just a quick refactor that I did. We have the sum.js and the sum.test.js. I just put that in a directory called O1 matchers. So if you want to do that, you can do it as well, just for organization's sake. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another directory called O2 async. And in here, I'm going to create an async.js. Async.js. And this is where we're going to have a function that is going to make an API request or an HTTP request to fetch some data, and it's going to return that data. And that is going to be 100% asynchronous. Now we're going to be using the JSON placeholder API, which is a very, very easy API, kind of a good API to use for learning purposes. So that is what we're going to be doing. And to make that request, we're going to be using a handy library called Axios. So just go ahead over here and just do npm install Axios. And let me just zoom in here a little bit. So npm install Axios. And here over here we installed Axios. Now what we want to do is we want to require Axios in. So let's just go ahead and let's require Axios. So require Axios. And now let's actually go ahead and create that function. So we're going to create the function called fetch data. Let's make this an arrow function. And now let's go over here and let's do const results. Results is equal to, and then we're going to do axios.get. This is how we perform a get request. And then the URL, I'm just going to type it here, is https JSON placeholder.typecode.com and then /todos, because we're going to get some to-dos, and then and then ID. So we're going to get one to-do here with this ID over here. So this is a parameter. So let's go ahead and let's just save this, and this is what we end up getting. Now what we ultimately might want to do is we want to pass in the ID and then fetch whatever ID it is that we want. So whatever to do with that ID we want. So we can have query params over here, and then our template literals, and then we can have our ID in there. Let me just quickly get rid of this. Okay, cool. So I hope this makes sense. Really all we're doing is just making a get request, and we're dynamically passing in the to-do's ID. And we should get a to-do. Now over here, of course, if we were to do something like return results, you probably guess that this is not really going to get us the results that we expect. For example, if I were to console.log fetch data, and then I were to move into the async directory, and I were to do node async, you see here that I get a pending promise. So you can see here, I get some sort of error, but really the log is a pending promise. And that's because this is asynchronous. This is asynchronous. So what we need to do is we need to handle this asynchronicity. So we would do that either through a .then. Oops, apologies for that. I should have turned off my phone. I really don't want to restart this whole video. So what I'm going to do is just going to continue on with this one. So as I was saying, we can handle this asynchronicity with with how we normally deal with promises, and that's going to be either through .then or async await. At this point, async await is pretty much common practice, so we're just going to do that as well. So we're going to have async await. And one thing that I want to quickly note is that this should be to-dos. So to-dos over here. And then in the module.export, this actually should be exports. So that was just a few typos that I found. And now what we can do, I also remove the console.log because it's not really that helpful. I'm going to log the results right in here. So I'm going to console.log these results. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute this function. So fetch data, and then pass in 1. And so if I were to execute this, you can see we get back this data over here, and ultimately this is what we want. We want the result.data, which gets us an object that has a user ID of 1, an ID of 1, and this is the to-do ID, and then we have a title, and then we have a completed status. So really what we want to do is we just want to return the results.data. So that is terrific, but now let's go ahead and let's test this. So inside of our async directory, what we can do is we can create an async.test.js. And in here, what we are going to be doing is, well, testing that function. So we absolutely need to import it. So let's just do fetch data. And what we're going to do is we're going to require in. So we're going to require in the fetch data from the async function. All right, so let's create a test block over here. And I'm going to say that this should return the correct to-do. And how are we going to know that? Well, if I call this function and I pass in the parameter 1, it should return the to-do with ID of 1. So that is what we are going to test. So should return correct return, what am I doing here? Return correct to do. And then over here, let's have this callback. And now what we could do is something like const, I don't know, to do is equal to fetch data. And then we're going to pass in 1. Now you might be thinking that this is not going to work, and it isn't. And that's because this is, well, asynchronous. But if you were to do something like, okay, we expect to do.id, because remember we get back this object, and then over here we can say to be 1. Well, this is not going to work. And again, you guys probably know why this is not going to work, because this is asynchronous. So let's actually just go ahead and let's just do an npm run test. And now this is going to run both of the test files over here, the sum.test.js and the async.test.js. Now, if we want to specify that we only want to run this one test over here, or this one test file, what we can do is we can just specify the name of the test by saying async. So now if we were to execute this, we get an error. And now what is this error? Well, it says that it received undefined. And that's because, again, this is asynchronous. So to deal with asynchronicity, we deal with it the same way that we deal with it if we're not writing tests. So again, we can have a .then, and then in here we can just get our to-do. And then over here we can just go ahead and expect that the to-do ID is 1. So this is completely valid, and this will work. There we go. Or I think a much better practice and a lot cleaner is just to use async. So let's just get rid of all of this. Let's just get rid of all of that. And over here, we're just going to do const to do is equal to await. So we're going to await this. And then we're going to just expect that the to-do ID is equal to 1 or to be 1. And of course, we need to have an async over here. Now, if we were to log this or test this, you can see that it works. And so you can see that dealing with asynchronous functions is actually not that different, or not different at all in a testing environment and in a development environment. We're just really handling these asynchronicities through, well, dealing with promises. So if you know how to deal with promises, you shouldn't have a big deal with actually dealing with asynchronicity in a test suite like Jest. So that is it for the asynchronous section. All right, my good friends, in this section, what we are going to be learning about is setting up things before we run a test and tearing down things after we run a test. And let me just go through an example where we might want to do this. So over here, I am going to create another directory. I'm going to call this O3, and I'm going to call this O3 setup, even though it's O3, should be called O3 setup and tear down. And so over here we have O3 setup, and as usual, let's just create a setup.test.js file. All right, cool. So let's say, for instance, we have an animals array, and we want to test this animals array. So let's say we have elephant as the first string, we have zebra as the second, bear as the third, and then tiger as the fourth. So we have an animals array that consists of these 4 animals. And now what we want to do is we want to, well, test it. So let's say what we want to do is we want to add an animal to this array, and we want to test that it was added appropriately. So let's actually put this in a describe block. We didn't do that in the last section. I forgot about that. Apologies. And let's go over here. Let's say animals array. We're testing the animals array. All right. And so now let's go ahead and let's put an it block. I hate when this happens. It block. And we're going to say should add animal to end of array. So we should add an animal to the end of the array. And what we're really just going to do is we're going to do an animals.push. So we're going to push a particular string. We're going to call this string alligator, and we're going to push it right to the end of this array. And now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and assert something. So we're going to expect that the animals, so this is the animals array, we want to get the last element, so it's going to be animals.length minus 1, because this is going to get us 4, because the length is 4 in this case. However, the index is going to be 3. So remember, because it starts at 0, 1, 2, 3. So this is going to be animals of 3, which is going to get us tiger. But if we add an element, then it's going to be 5, and then it's going to be minus 1. So it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, and then, or 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, which is going to be the alligator. And so we're going to expect this to be alligator. Alligator. So this is very easy. You guys probably understand this. Let's just do an npm run test, and we just want to run this test file. So let's just say setup. And this passes. Oh, okay, that works as expected. Now let's say we also want to, maybe we don't want to add an animal to the end of the array. We want to add an animal to the beginning of the array. So over here, what we can possibly do is something like should add animal to beginning of array. And instead of push, in this case, we use unshift. And let's add a different animal. And this animal is going to be monkey. And then over here, we're going to say monkey. And the beginning of the array will always be index of 0. So we can just say index of 0. So let's go ahead. Let's assert this. And there we go. It passes. Now let's say we also have another test that tests that the initial length of this should be 4. Okay, this is a very easy test. Should have initial length of 4. Very, very easy. You guys probably know how to do this. We can just do expect animals.length. And we're going to say here dot to be 4. So let's go ahead and let's execute this, and it fails. All right, so let's go over here and let's diagnose why it failed. As you can see here, it expected 4, but it received 6. So what actually happened is because of these tests over here, the tests that were executed before it, it actually manipulated our array, manipulated our database, if you will, and it added animals in here. And so this is probably not what we want to do. What we don't want this test, what it's ultimately testing, the array, to be altered by this test. And similarly, we don't want this test, the array that we're testing, to be altered by this test. So what we could do in this case is just do something like, okay, we can just reset the animals to equal this. So we can just say animals is equal to this, and then for this test, animals is equal to this, and then for this test, animals is equal to this. So in this case, if we were to do this, it would pass. But this is not very dry. A very important rule in programming is you want to not repeat yourself. So let's just think about what I am doing here. I'm running this code, I guess, before each of the kind of main logic execution. So I'm running this right over here within the test, but before the actual logic that we are testing. So we're really running this before each test. So what can we do to run this piece of code before each test, but not just put it in here for each test, because it's not very dry? Well, Jest has this very neat function called before each. And what this is going to do is run whatever piece of code we put in it before, well, each test. So now let's actually get rid of this. So if we were to get rid of this, and then if we were to put that piece of code in here, and we were to execute this again, it passes because it's running this before each test. And just to prove it to you, I'm going to say here before each. I'm going to console.log before each. So if we were to execute this, you can see here before each, before each, before each. So we have 3 tests, and this is running before each test. So we might want to eventually do this. So this is a very, very good practical reason why we might want to use this before each method. Now, we also have something called an after each. Sometimes we want to tear down some things after each test. So over here, we can have an after each. In this case, we could also add the same thing. It's probably not necessary. Well, it's definitely not necessary because we have it in the before each. But just for clarification, we can also have a after each that runs after each test. And so let's go here. Let's just console.log after each, just to illustrate that this works as expected. So it still works. And you can see here that we have before each and then after each. Before each and then after each. And this is the order that it's going to work with. It's going to obviously run the before each first, and then it's going to run the after each first. And this is going to, again, run after each test. Now, one thing that I also want to note is sometimes you want to do something just once before you run all of your tests. So to do this, instead of using before each, what you would do is before all. So before all. So this is going to run just once before all of your tests. So over here, I'm just gonna log this. And actually, let's say that our array is empty, and we might just want to seed this data. So before all, we might just want to seed our database, if you will. Even though at this point we're really kind of doing the same thing. I'm just really copying and pasting the same thing here. And this is before all. So the way that this is going to be ordered is this is going to run first, and then the before each is going to run, and then the after each is going to run. So if you were to execute this, you can see here at the very top, you get a before all, then before each, before each, after each, before each, after each. And, you know, similarly, you might imagine that we also have an after all. So over here, we can have an after all, and we're just gonna have the same thing, after all. So over here, we're just gonna change this to after all. Let's execute this one last time. And as you see here, before all, before each, after each, before each, after each. And over here at the very end, we have the after all. All right, cool. And this is always the order. This is not because I ordered them in this way. If I were to change this to the very top, this is always going to be executed last. So it's not because I ordered it this way. Now, let me just get rid of all of this because it's getting a little bit messy. I hope you guys kind of get the point here. Now, one thing that I want to note is, what if we had, you know, another test that wasn't really testing the animals array? So it wasn't really testing the animals array. So let's say over here we have it block, or sorry, another describe block. So describe, and then over here, you know, testing something else. So it's not testing the animals array. Let's just have a very quick test here. So we're going to say it, and then we're going to say, you know, true should be truthy. Very, very weird and stupid test, but that's what it is. So we're just going to do here, expect true to be truthy. Again, very weird test. But now if we were to execute this, you can see here, and actually let me show you something that's really neat. So you can see here that we have a before each, and then we have a before each, and then the before each, and then also the before each is running after this test, even though this test really has nothing to do with the array. And just to prove this to you, if you just want to run one test in a test file just for debugging purposes, you can do an it.only. And if we were to execute this, now we get just one test pass, 3 were skipped. And you can see here that the before each was still ran, even though, again, the before each is not really doing anything as it pertains to this test. So here's a common rule. If you want to run a before each function after each test and every test in your test file, then you just put it over here in the top level. However, if you want to run a before each or an after each, this applies to all of the different methods: before each, after each, before all, after all. So this applies to all of them. But if you wanted to just apply this to a group of tests in your test file and not other tests, then what you're going to want to do is not put it at the top level, but instead put it in the describe block. Put it in the describe block that those groups of tests are in. And that way, this before each is now only going to be running for these tests, but it's not going to be running for this test. So again, let me just execute this. And remember, I have the it.only here. And if I were to run this again, you can see I don't get that console log. Now let's just get rid of that it.only. And just to again prove it to you, now what we get instead is we get 3 before eaches, and those are corresponding to these ones. So these tests, 1, 2, 3, but this one doesn't get a before each. So that is pretty much it. So again, we set up our tests with the before each and before all, and we can tear them down and do some cleanup with the after each and after all. All right, my friends, in this section, what I am going to be doing is teaching you all about mocks. So let's just go through an example scenario so I can explain what mocks are and why they're useful. So over here we have our fetch data function. We went through this in the asynchronous section. And what if what we wanted to do is test this? So we wanted to test this. And also imagine we have maybe a lot more code. We have validation in here and all these things. And we just wanted to test that this function works appropriately. Well, when we write a test, we're kind of banking on that this API over here also works and is going to return back the data that is expected. We're pretty much banking on that. Now, if it were to fail, or if it were to return some data that it wasn't expected, if there was a bug in it, then this whole function test would fail. Even though the function might be working exactly the way that it should be, because we're making this API request and this API request failed, somewhere in the server it failed, the whole function failed. And that's probably not great. You can imagine that that can make our function calls or our functions very, very flaky. Our function tests very flaky. And again, ultimately, that's not what we want. So what we can do instead is, what if instead of actually making this call, we just mock it? So over here with this, what we do is we expect an object with an ID that is a number, a to-do that is a string, and a completed status that is a Boolean. Well, what if instead of actually making this call, we just mock the returned value of it? And so we just mock just some random object with an ID as well as a to-do and as well as a completed status. And that way, because we're mocking it, we're actually not really making that HTTP request, and we can ensure that we're always going to get back that object. And that way we can just test our function implementation. And that right there is the power of mocks and why mocks are really useful. So let's actually go ahead as usual. Let's create O4 mocks. So O4 mocks directory, and I'm going to create a mocks.test.js file. And let's just get rid of all of these. Terrific. And now let's just begin. So let us just begin with a very, very easy function. And we're going to call this function for each. So if you guys know what the built-in for each method is doing, we're going to pretty much do that right here. So this function is going to take in an items. So this is going to be an array. So just to kind of reiterate what the for each does, you would have some sort of array, and then over here we would have a for each. So we would loop through every single element in that for each, and then we would perform some sort of logic. So over here we have the elements, and over here we have the callback. So we're just going to rebuild this. So this is the items, which is going to be the array. And then also as a second parameter, it's going to take a callback. So it's going to take a callback. So let's do that. And then over here, what we're going to do is we're going to build that for each. So let's just loop through it. So we're going to say let I is equal to 0. And we're going to say as long as I is less than items.length. It's just a typical for loop. We're going to do I++. All right. And then for each iteration, what we're going to do is call this callback. So we're going to call this callback over here. And then this callback is going to take in whatever element we're currently iterating over. So items of I. All right, this is a very simple function. I hope you guys understand what that's doing. But now let's go ahead and test this. And what I want to do is I actually want to mock this callback over here. And let me show you how we can do that. Instead of actually passing in a function, I want to mock it. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to write an it statement. I'm going to say mock callback. All right. So let's do that. And let's go ahead and create that mocked callback. So I'm going to say mocked or mock callback. And what I'm going to do to create a mock function in Jest, you do jest.function. And that right there creates a mock function. Very, very easy. Now what we can also do is for that mock function, we can also give that mock function some logic. So we can say that this mock function expects x as a parameter. And what it does is it just adds 42 to x. So it's 42 plus x. So this is just a callback over here that we added into this mock function. So you can basically think that this mock function is something like this. So const mock is equal to x, and then all it's doing is just doing 42 plus x. That's really all it's doing. Okay, so now let's just go through this and let's mock it. So let's call for each. So we're gonna call for each, and we're gonna pass in an array of two numbers, 0 and 1. So remember, we take in an array, and we're gonna iterate through that array, and then we're going to call that callback with each element. So we're gonna call the callback with 0, and then we're gonna call the callback with 1. Okay, so that is the first parameter. And then the second parameter, instead of actually providing a real callback, let's just provide a mocked callback. So over here we have our mocked callback. And now what we can do is we can actually utilize this mocked callback to perform some really cool tests. For example, what we can do is let's write an expect. And what we can say is mocked callback dot mock. So each callback has this mock property, and what this mock property has is a bunch of the data that is associated to that mocked callback. So let's just go through some of them. So for example, it has a bunch of the calls. So we can do calls, and we can say dot length, and then we expect these calls to be 2. Because remember, we're going to iterate through this twice, and thus we're going to call this callback twice. So if we were to execute this, let's just clear this over here. And now if I were to do npm run test and then mocks, it should pass, and it does. Cool. And now what we can also do is we can let's do another one. So let's do mock callback, and then we can do dot mock, and then what we can do is we can do dot calls. But this time what we can do is we can actually specify what we got. So now the first parameter, so this calls, what it does is returns an array. It returns an array of all the calls, and that's why over here our array is length 2, because we called it twice. So we have the first element. So the first call is going to be index 0, and then the second call is going to be index 1. So just to kind of put an example here. So calls is going to be probably some sort of object, or actually is going to be some sort of object, and or actually it's just some sort of item, and this is going to be call 1. And then over here we're going to have call 2. And so that's why we have dot length to be 2. So what we can do is we can get the very first call, and then what we can do is we can also get the parameter that was passed in. Right now there's only one parameter passed in, but if you have multiple, we can get them by indexing them. So the first parameter that was passed in is 0, the second one is 1, the third one is 2. So we can get the second parameter if we want to. And then we can expect this, well, to be 0. So we can expect that to be 0, which makes absolute sense. So if we were to execute this, we get, well, let's actually get rid of that. We only get one passing test because we have both expects in this one test over here. But just to prove to you, if I were to change this to 1, then it would fail. All right. So if the test passes, then you know all of the expects work. Probably, again, not good practice to do that, but to put a lot of expects into just one it block, highly suggest that you can separate them out so you know exactly what is failing. But this is just for demonstrative purposes. So this passes, terrific. Now let's get the second call. And so we're going to put 1 there. And then the first parameter in the second call, well, we're going to expect that to be 1. Because remember, our array over here is 0, 1. So if we were to execute this, passes. All right. And so also what we can do is we can get the value that this function ends up returning. So let's just copy this. And so over here, what we can do is we can do mock callback.mock, and then we can do, instead of .calls, we can do .results. And then we also have to, again, specify which call, because remember, this got called twice, which call we want. Well, we want the first call. And what we do is we expect that the value of this, to be 42. Because remember, what this function is doing is it's getting a parameter. In the first call, this parameter is going to be 0. And it's going to get that parameter and add 42 to it. So 42 plus 0 is equal to 42. Now, if we were to do the same thing over here, but with the second, we will expect this to be 43 because this is 1. So let's go here. Let's call this everything passes. Terrific. All right, cool. So now let's move on to something else. So what we can also do is we can create a mock function and just mock its return value. Instead of having this compute over here, we can just mock its return value. So over here, we can say mock return, and then let's create a mock function. I'm just going to call this mock. So we're going to do just.function, and that's going to create a mock function for us. And now what we can do is we can do mock dot and then mock return value once. And then this, what it can do is we can put in any value that we want. So we can say true, false, whatever. And so now if we were to go do const results, and we can just call mock, well, if we were to assert this, we can say results dot to be, and we can expect that to be true. So if we were to call this, you can see that that test passed. And therefore, we don't actually have to go through any sort of logic. We can just mock its return value to whatever it is that we want. Now, one thing that I want to note is you can actually append this multiple times. So you can go here and append this as many times as you want. And you can actually change the value. So this could be false, and then this can be hello. So we can just do that. Now you might be thinking, okay, what is going on here? So the first call is going to return this, and then the second call, if I were to call this mock function again, well, it's going to return this, and then the third call is going to return hello. So if I were to just do these assertions right now, so if I were to get results 2 and then results 3, I'm going to expect this to be false. And then I'm going to expect this to be hello. And if we were to execute this, it should pass. And it does. Cool. All right. So the last thing that I want to do is I want to kind of go through this example that I've illustrated, this over here. So remember, what we wanted to ultimately do is just mock this Axios function. So let's just go here and let's mock it. So let's just copy and paste it in. And what we ultimately want to do is we want to mock Axios. So note that I imported Axios. And the best way I feel like to mock something like this is to spy on it. And spying on it, you can just think of it as a mock. So instead of it having the implementation, we're just going to spy on it and return the mock value that we ultimately want. So let's go over here. And what we can do here is mock Axios. And the way that I'm going to do this with Axios is going to be very similar to the way that you would mock things with your own built-in functions. So we want to mock Axios. So ultimately what we want to do, and this is going to be asynchronous, so let's just put async, and then over here we're going to do const results is equal to await. We're going to call this, but we don't actually want to make the HTTP request. What we want to do is we want to just mock Axios. So to do that, what we can do is we can do jest.spyon, and we can say that we want to spy on Axios. So Axios is going to be the first parameter that we define. The second parameter is going to be, well, what method in Axios do we want to spy on? So the first parameter always has to be an object, and then the second parameter is going to be the method. And so we want to spy on the get method, or the get method over here. So we can do that. And then what we can do is we can add mock return value once. And then over here, what we can say is, well, we're going to return data. And so we're going to turn data. Remember, because over here, results.data. And then in here, we can have another object. And then in here, I'm just wondering how this works. Return data, and then we're gonna have an ID of 1, and let's say a to-do of hello, my friends. Even though that's not really a to-do. You know what? Let's change it to get 1 million subs. That is going to be my to-do for today. So get 1 million subs. And so now what we can do actually is we can expect. So we can expect that the results dot to be get 1 million subs. So if we were to execute this, it works. And you can see that this has been mocked. And just to prove that this has been mocked, what we can do is we can just do a console.log results over here. And if I were to execute this, you can see that the result is this over here, this mocked function that we created. So it didn't actually make this HTTP request. It took our word for it and it mocked it. All right, so that is pretty much it for this crash course. Hopefully you guys learned a lot about Jest, and I'll see you guys in the next one.